Hello and welcome. My name's Philip, and today we're going to be continuing our series on the chain of being, the cosmological concept that underpins all of medieval society. Now, if you haven't seen our introduction to the topic yet, I would suggest that you watch that first, as in this video we're going to be digging a little deeper and exploring just how the chain of being fits into the political and social structures of medieval Europe, specifically feudalism. Now, among historians, there is still a lot of debate as to what constitutes a feudal system. It wasn't a word that was used in the medieval period. Although the word feudal has existed since at least the 15th century, feudalism wasn't coined until the 18th century, and a precise definition of feudal system wasn't proposed until 1944 by historian François-Louis Ganchoff. Ganchoff himself admitted that his definition was limited, and to this day, a strict definition is still seldom agreed upon. However, for the sake of this video, we'll just discuss the broad strokes which are generally accepted as what make up a feudal system. Typically, the hallmarks of a feudal system are a society in which land equals power, and that land is held in exchange for service or labour. It is a society with clear social divisions and a warrior class, and power comes from a central, sovereign authority, typically a king. This type of society has existed in Europe from at the latest the 9th century until roughly around the 15th century, depending on where you live. But the term is also used to describe comparable political systems in other parts of the world, such as feudal Japan. A feudal system, then, is one that has become rather infamous nowadays, featuring a strict hierarchical class system and a ruling warrior elite. You may already be able to see how the chain of being fits into the feudal system. Everyone has a place in the chain, a rung on the social ladder, from the lowliest serf to the mightiest king. We're probably all familiar with the idea of the nobility, bloodlines and rank, the lords and magnates at the top, and then the peasants and serfs down at the bottom. However, it wasn't just as simple as, I'm a noble and therefore I'm better than you. The ideal society to which Europe was supposed to be striving was meant to be morally good, and therefore appeal to all good Christians. This meant that outright subjugation and wanton cruelty, like kicking over peasants in the street, couldn't be a part of it. Instead, the medieval worldview emphasised the interconnectivity of societal roles and stressed the ideas of responsibilities and privileges. This can best be seen in the concept of the three estates, the three faces of medieval European society. The laboratores, those who worked, were responsible for producing the food and goods needed for themselves and the other estates. The bellatores, those who fought, were responsible for the defence of themselves and the other estates from enemies both foreign and domestic. The oratores, those who prayed, were responsible for the spiritual well-being of themselves and others. And since order was good, they made up a great deal of the bureaucracy of the medieval period. Within the three estates, there were further divisions of rank, And it may come as no surprise that the oratores had the most plentiful and complicated differentiations. The important thing to take away, though, is that each of these ranks had a place in this divinely ordained structure. They were all necessary parts of the chain. And that's something that is quite easily overlooked when discussing feudalism nowadays. As fun as the image is of a grotesque lord dripping in riches whilst mud-covered peasants work themselves to death in a field, it is for the most part a Victorianism. Whether it was practiced or not, the lesson of the chain of being was one of mutual respect and duty. People of lower rank were occupying a lower but no less important rung on the social ladder. But what about the very top rung? The king found themselves in a very interesting position, being both a landlord, divinely ordained, and a warrior. The position comes with a plethora of privileges without a doubt, but they were all hinged on the fact that it came with some serious responsibilities. Responsibilities such as defense, justice, finance, diplomacy, and many others. In regards to the chain of being, however, they can most often be boiled down to maintain social order. The king's job was to ensure his kingdom strove for that divine order. It was his moral imperative. It drew heavily on the language of the Bible, appealing to Jesus Christ as the King of Kings, the supreme example, and to the kingdom of heaven. In the medieval period, we see the depiction of Christ enthroned become commonplace, and images of mortal kings seem to invite the comparison. We also see medieval society holding up examples of great moral kings. In the 14th century, author Jacques de Longuyon described the 9 worthies, historical and scriptural figures who were the exemplars of chivalric virtue. Of the 9 worthies, there's a chief, a warrior priest, then 4 kings, a prince, and 2 emperors. That's all well and good in theory, I hear you say, but what about in practice? We know there were all sorts of kings who did nasty things and abused their people. What about King John, eh? Well, you are absolutely right. There were a bunch of bad kings, and the medieval world had a special name for them: tyrants. When a king started abusing their privileges and not performing their duties, there was almost always a civil war or uprising or revolt of some kind. And it makes sense. If a king isn't doing their job, then they're not the real king. And it has suddenly become the duty of the magnates to get rid of him and put the real king on the throne. Now, who exactly is the real king is the cause for another bunch of wars in itself, but the logic is there. It's worth noting, however, that these civil wars and uprisings are almost always framed as a means of re-establishing the social order when it has been knocked awry by a tyrant. The moral imperative of the chain of being was to get everyone and everything back into their proper place. And this is why threats against a true king and treason were seen as such heinous crimes. They were attempting to subvert or damage that ordained social order. There was, however, another threat to social order that developed in the 11th and 12th centuries in England, and that was social mobility. The emergent middle class was worrying for a number of reasons. The first is that it seemed at odds with the chain of being. You did your job because it was your duty. And although money changed hands, to suggest that accruing money was your goal would be seen as avaricious. Mercenary work, though often more reliable, was also seen as distasteful. A whole new mercantile class, then, was something that shook that social order. However, it was required for society to advance. What's worse, though, up until this point, money had generally been tied to land, and therefore went hand in hand with nobility. The fact that there could be city merchants who had more wealth than country knights raised some rather uncomfortable questions about their position in hierarchy. Interestingly, it seems that for the Normans, their meritocratic principles came to the fore and provided a neat solution. If someone was succeeding in a particular role, it was agreed upon that that simply meant that that was the role they were supposed to have had all along. They were simply revealing where in the chain of being they actually belonged. Practically, this meant that a particularly wealthy merchant may suddenly find themselves being treated as nobility as long as nobody asked too many questions. But this commitment to social hierarchy is a fundamental part of the chain of being, and what for a lot of people seems to define a feudal system. It rears its head again in later centuries when laws are actually introduced to dictate what kind of food, clothing and jewellery people should have access to depending on their class. In England, the first of these sumptuary laws appears during the rule of Edward III, but it makes sense to the medieval mind. The job of the law is to maintain social order, and thanks to the chain of being, that social order is very clearly defined. But what about people who find themselves outside of that social structure? How does medieval society view them? How exactly does it view itself? And these are exactly the kinds of questions that we're going to try and answer in our next video. But until then, thanks for watching. Farewell. Hey everyone, thanks again so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this kind of crash course in the feudal system. It's quite a big topic and there's a lot to cover. If you think actually that you'd like to hear us cover it in a bit more detail, maybe talk a bit more about the three estates in future, let us know down in the comments. We may do some future videos on those subjects as well. But until our next video, take care of yourselves. Thank you very much. Farewell. Put it in my brain. Boop. Sort of kicking peasants over in the street was not only frowned upon, it was really bad.